This is A Geek Leader. Hey, Geek Leaders. Welcome to episode 154 of a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda, and today's episode is brought to you by Splashtop, a remote access solution. Try Splashtop to remote into your work computer from home, especially if your computer requires heavy CPU processing or terabytes of storage that you cannot replicate at home. Splashtop announces the capability to stream ultra high resolution quality during remote sessions, as if you were sitting there right in front of your computer at your high-end workstation. All types of professionals are now using Splashtop. Fast 4K streaming to access high-performance workstations from home, including TV weather forecasters, connecting to their weather computers, studio professionals for remote video editing and rendering, game developers, designers, architects working with 3D models. Definitely check out Splashtop. I've been using it for 7 years personally, and as an enterprise, we've been using it for 3 years. It's an excellent product. You can get a discount and a free trial by going to ageekleader.com/splashtop. All right, Geek Leaders, today on the show, I've got Timothy Lupfer, and he is retired from the Army and retired from Deloitte, and he has written a book called Leadership Tough Love, and we're going to talk about that. Tough love is kind of one of those things that my family, we always give each other tough love, where we kind of pick on each other and have good things. Some people might not know what tough love is, so Timothy, welcome to the show, and tell us a little bit about what tough love is when it comes to leadership.
Well, thanks very much, John. What I'm trying to describe here is I think there's too much muddled thinking about leadership. It's a very important term, and I think too much I see people just using vague ways of describing it. And actually what I'm trying to do is to say, look, leadership is a very specific thing, and I define it very precisely. And with regard to that, it's a very difficult thing to exercise. And we need to be very straightforward about what we need in leaders. And so that's what I mean about tough love. Let's take a cold, hard look at what leadership actually is, and let's make the demands on ourselves as leaders and on the demands of leaders that we have that people can live up to what they need to demonstrate.
Mm-hmm. So when you define leadership, what do you say that is? What is a leader in your definition?
Sure. Well, actually, let me define leadership because I define leadership as the role wherein you must affect, A-F-F-E-C-T, affect followers to achieve the organizational goals. And, that's a very quick definition, but I think it's a pretty powerful one. And if I can dissect it just real quickly, first of all, leadership is a role. It is a position you have because that position gives you authority. And I'll talk about authority in a minute. Authority is one of the two major tools leaders use. The other is influence. But basically, leadership is a role. And oh, by the way, most of us are in these roles, not by vote. We're given these roles by whatever organization we're in, particularly in business. And so I think it's very important to understand that it's a role. And you have followers. Mm-hmm. And that's, people say, duh, that's obvious. But in many respects, I think we have to be precise and say followers. Because what this means is people who are celebrities or just have general influence, that's not necessarily being a leader at all. Because we try to influence each other all the time. I try to influence my wife. She's a pretty tough cookie from New Jersey, and she's going to tell you, no, I'm not leading her. I'm just trying to influence her. But when you're a leader, you also have authority, and that's usually granted by the organization or by the position you're in, like a parent. And then the third part is to achieve the organizational goals. A leader is not there with people who are just slavishly devoted to the leader. No, the leader's there to achieve organizational goals, and those goals are shared or should be shared by all the people involved, the leader and the follower. So that's what I mean by a precise definition.
Okay. So like you said, most of the time with authority, you're not voted into that position, or it's not really you're kind of given that role. How is it that, let's say, someone like me, I'm working along with my team, I'm a software developer or an IT engineer or something like that, and I get promoted above some other people that maybe they were going out for that position too, and they're not necessarily happy that I got that position. What should I do, and how should I use that authority that's given to me to kind of bring people along?
Well, you're right, and that's a very tough position when somebody has been elevated from a specialist role with a group of peers, and now you are a leader, which means you have people as followers, and you've been given the authority by the organization. Mm-hmm. But basically, there are two tools that you need to use as a leader, and one is top-down, which is the authority, and the other is bottom-up, which is your influence. And by influence, I mean your personal interactions with people. And both of those tools are extremely important. And my observation is, over my life, that the most effective leaders know when each is appropriate. Certainly, I'd say, particularly given that we're in an age right now where people are extremely sensitive and very, very self-aware, we need to be very, very skilled on the influence piece, because that's the more subtle piece of getting followers to achieve the organizational goal. But authority, which is the top down, is not a dirty word, and it's always going to be there. And there are times, sometimes because of the demands of time, sometimes simply because the organization, for a variety of reasons, and in many cases very good reasons, says this is the way we've got to do it. And so there are times the leader has to say, we have to do it this way. I'm going to lead you there, but we're not asking for permission. This is what we're going to do. And that, by the way, is a tough message, and it's one that new leaders need to learn how to do. They need to be able to invoke their authority when appropriate. Of course, the problem is, and we all know this, John, there are people who use authority as a club, and I call it the lazy default. They fall back on authority all the time, when in fact it should always be a mix of authority and influence. And so basically for the new leader, first of all, you got to understand what authority you have, and very importantly, what authority you don't have. Because as a leader, you never want to exceed or try to exceed the authority and find out that you don't have that authority, which can ruin your credibility right there. So as a new leader, you have to understand what authority you have, and you really have to work and practice on using influence, and to do that most effectively. So if you want, I can talk a little bit about what influence is and what are the things that you use.
Yeah. And also like when you should use influence versus authority.
Well, I would say as a general rule, when you don't have a supreme urgency of time, in other words, when there's not a crisis or a demand of time, you should try the softer piece, which is influence, as opposed to the authority. For one thing, by the way, if you've been designated by the organization as a leader, you've got that authority there anyway. So, and people, by the way, we're all wired to get authority. As much as we may complain about it, we all get it, and we all get status. So, in other words, when I'm saying you've already got a certain degree of authority that people know automatically, but the more indirect or softer piece is influence. And influence is pretty complicated. I mean, for one thing, part of influence is subconscious. For example, if you're taller, does that help? Yeah, actually it does. There's empirical evidence to point out that such things as being bigger, being taller, being good looking, all of those things make people follow a little bit more readily. Now, does that mean that mere mortals like me who don't have the blessings of Hollywood looks can't lead? No. It just means we have to understand that there's some things, particularly subconsciously, that can be advantages, and if we have them, that's great. But then probably the main thing is on the conscious level, which is where you're interacting with someone directly. And this is where the skills of communication become extremely important. That's a huge influence piece. And this also has to do, one of the things to remember too, is that we as humans are extremely visual. A few years ago, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, there was this thing about, some people are visual, some are audible, meaning hearing, and some are tactile. Evidence has shown that that's all baloney. Over half our neurons are dedicated to seeing, to the visual. And so my point is, it's very important to have visual contact with the followers. And if that means it's remote, that means checking in maybe with Skype or Zoom or whatever, but always trying to emphasize the direct personal communication and making it visual whenever possible.
So what kind of difference does visual have over audio?
Well, visual, like I'm saying, we are visual animals. Mm-hmm. And so basically what I'm saying is if you can meet someone face to face, that's the best.
Yeah. I've heard several things where people say like, more than half of the communication is done through body language and what you see, with the person, not necessarily the words they say. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think sometimes that's a bit exaggerated, but I think what it does point out is that there's an unconscious or subconscious aspect to it, which is the body language. And then there's the direct communication. And I would say basically you need to be aware of both. Mm-hmm. But let's be honest, John, if somebody looks you in the eye and says you're fired, you know what? The recipient doesn't care what the body language is. The message is pretty clear. And so what I would say is let's not get so hung up on body language that we forget the importance of the direct communication as well.
Yeah.
And basically I would say that comes with practice. And that's why leadership is a lot of hard work. It takes practice. I'll be very honest with you. I think this idea of the natural or charismatic leader is extremely rare. I've very seldom seen it. And for most of us, we just have to work at it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's one thing that people get confused about. At least, I've been doing this podcast for a while. I've had, well over 100 interviews, and during this time, we've talked to people, and some of the folks that are listeners, they'll say, "Well, I just wasn't born a leader." But I think people forget the fact that leadership is more of a skill that can be developed. It's like a muscle you have to work at, and you have to exercise it. It's not necessarily something you're born. Maybe you're born with more charisma, or you're born with something that could help you be a better leader. But I think leadership is something that you do have to exercise and work at, just like you do anything else.
Yes, John, I agree with that very much. In my book, I do have a chapter devoted to charisma, in which I say, first of all, it's extremely rare. We use the term charismatic too often, and we really too often say after someone's already successful, we say, oh, they were charismatic. No, charisma comes from the Greek word meaning a gift, and it's the person that walks in the room and you've never heard of this person before. And this person engages you, and all of a sudden a switch in your mind says, whatever this person says, I'm going to go along with it. That's rare, and in most cases in history, not all, but most, it's been very dangerous. Think of Jim Jones and the 900 people who committed suicide with him. That's charisma gone wrong. And the point I'm trying to make is most of us don't have charisma. By the way, we don't want it. And as followers, we don't want it either, because we want to maintain a certain skepticism and a certain autonomy from our leaders, because that's actually more healthy. And so let's just say leadership is hard work, and it takes a lifetime of practice. And I have never met anyone that was a perfect leader in all situations. I've never seen it. That's why we got to work at it.
Yeah, that's why we're all human, right? We all make mistakes, and
absolutely.
I think it's really, you made a really good point about making sure you have that checks and balances with that skepticism, to hold people accountable, because sometimes the Jim Jones example of I watched a documentary on that not too long ago, actually, of how those people just blindly followed, sold their stuff, moved, and then drank the Kool-Aid.
Yep. By the way, too, I always have to say, it wasn't Kool-Aid. It was Flavor-Aid.
Flavor-Aid.
Which is one of the worst marketing disasters of all time for Kool-Aid, because it wasn't Kool-Aid. But not that that's really a funny subject. It's just interesting that it wasn't really Kool-Aid. It was this other thing called Flavor-Aid.
It was the knockoff.
Yeah, that's right. It was an Oslo. Um,
So,
now, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, your book's entitled "Leadership Tough Love." How would you define tough love? Because I know for me and my family, it's like the I guess I would call it the process of pointing out the obvious sometimes, even if it hurts someone's feelings a little bit, because it's all there to make you a better person in the long run and to help you out in the long run. And sometimes it's hard to hear.
Well, you're right. And I think you've described it actually very accurately. It is tough and it is love. It's tough because it's straightforward. It's tough because you are trying to speak the truth, or at least as you see it. Mm-hmm. And it's not sugar-coated. It's not, it's not indirect. It's not passive-aggressive. It's, eyeball. Here's what I see. Here's what the problem is. Here's what needs to be fixed. Boom. But the love part is it is given in the interest of improving. Mm-hmm. And it's a tough message. And you know this, with your own family. And I know this. I have 2 kids and I got 7 grandkids. And so now I see the next generation dealing with it. And a lot of times you do have to pull people aside and be very straightforward with them and say, this, whatever it is, this behavior, let's say, is unacceptable and it must be corrected. And it must be corrected because by correcting it, it's going to make things better and it's going to make you more effective, whatever the end point is. But you've got to do that. And it's very important for leaders to learn how to do this because, as I describe in the book, one of the toughest things for a leader to do is to be put in charge of a group that must either change its behavior radically and or improve dramatically. Mm-hmm. Because in those situations, people are going to push back. Nobody likes to be told that they're not doing the right thing or that their behavior isn't effective or their behavior is destructive or whatever. None of us likes criticism. And so you've got to deliver this kind of thing. And I think this is one of the real challenges for a leader.
So how has the military maybe helped you when it comes to that idea? I like to call it, where you're managing change. You're managing a team changing. You mentioned that's the toughest thing you can do. And I read a book a while back about, I think it was called Turn That Ship Around. It was about a Navy captain that came in and kind of revamped the way a ship ran just with subtle changes. But how has the military maybe helped you in giving you some of that practical things that you can use in business to help turn teams around and to improve things when you're going through change?
Well, that's a very good point. And first of all, let me just step back and say my period in the Army, I graduated from West Point in 1972. That's when the United States Army was starting to come out of Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And to be very blunt, the Army I went into as a second lieutenant was very dysfunctional. It had, oh my God, a host of problems. And it was a pretty rough place. It was a very, very tough environment. And during that period, I was in the Army. I served for 20 years. I can say by the early 80s, things really had started to improve. And certainly the force that we took into Desert Storm, and I commanded a tank battalion, which was it was a reinforced tank battalion, so it was well over 700 soldiers in Desert Storm in combat. Let me tell you, that army was outstanding. So I saw this institution change for the better during my career in the Army. And that's really one of the things I saw. Now, specifically the military culture is very straightforward compared to business. Mm-hmm. I think that, it's not subtle. And it's not subtle, first of all, because people rotate in and out. The turnover in a peacetime unit sometimes approaches 100% in a year. So you have people coming in and out of roles. So you have to be pretty quick to point things out and to get people in line and to get everybody on the same page. So first of all, it's a very direct environment. And oh, by the way, I had to learn to tone it down big time when I retired from the Army and went into business. I very quickly realized this is not the Army. People are not inured to things being quite so direct. The other thing about the military is its authority is very well defined. Mm-hmm. That's what rank is and stuff. And yeah, you go through the gestures of the saluting and the politeness, addressing superiors as sir or ma'am. And I know sometimes that's parodied in TV shows and stuff. But really, those are just habits which reinforce the fact that people are very clear about who has authority. And that's one of the things that I have found very interesting about business. Things are a lot more ambiguous there. And sometimes that's not a good thing for business. I'm not saying business needs to orient like the military and be that precise. But too many times I've seen young people get into positions of leadership, particularly for the first time in business, and they have no knowledge of how much authority they have because nobody's bothered to tell them. And so they kind of, flail away and try different things out. And sometimes, they can figure it out, and sometimes they make some bad mistakes. And also, I think leadership development in business is not nearly as well developed as it is in the military. Now, part of the reason is in the military, you can see a career and a career pattern and a succession into different jobs. Whereas, and this is not a criticism business, business is much more flexible, and it has to be much more adaptive because things change so much in business. But even so, I think we need to do a better job in business of developing people to be leaders. And as you and I will discuss shortly, not everyone needs to be a leader. At least that's my opinion. There are some jobs that call for leadership, and there's some jobs that don't. And I think that distinction is extremely important. But I do think we need to do a better job in business of developing new leaders, helping them understand what authority is, what influence is, what you've got to practice, what you've got to learn.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that right now, because I know in my career, I started out as kind of working in IT, working in technology, trying to be a superstar, trying to learn all the skills and technologies that I could. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, you're really good at this skill, so let's make you a manager. And, kind of moved me into that role. And it was kind of like the only way I could increase my salary, the only way I feel like I was, making progress, which is something that a lot of us geeks like to do. We like to make progress. We like to improve upon something. And, being thrown in there without the development, like you say, we really need. I didn't know what authority I had. I didn't even know the difference between authority and influence at that point. It was just said, hey, now you're a manager. These people figure it out. And I realized really quickly that, leading people and managing people is completely different than writing code. And
Absolutely.
And I didn't know how to handle that. You say some people really don't need to be leaders. What do you mean by that, and how does that relate to kind of the story that I'm telling?
Well, I think it relates pretty well to what you're saying, and I got to tell you, the story that you just described, I've heard this hundreds of times from people, and I've seen it acted out, and that's why in my book I make a distinction. And the thing is, look, this is not the tablets from Mount Sinai. This is just my ideas. And so I just want to throw them out because I think it'll help people think about these things. But I make a distinction between a specialist and a leader. Now, up front, I want to say I am not necessarily saying that these roles or a person in these roles are mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. I do think that specialists certainly can become leaders. But there is a change when you go from specialist to leader that I think is very important to acknowledge and to prepare for. And what I mean by this is there are people out there, and it's extremely important, who want to devote their energies, their life to a specific body of knowledge, or it can be a process. But that's what a specialist is. It's somebody who wants to get very deep into something that's very challenging. And this is extremely important. That's why we had the Salk vaccine against polio. Specialists are extraordinarily important. But here's the key. there are a lot of people who go into specialty roles who do not want to take on the burden of leading people, because people are a burden.
Yes.
When you, and you're laughing because you know, and you've been through it. People are complex. They're vexing. They're frustrating. They're also rewarding. But when you take on the role of a leadership, it means you have people who are followers, and you've got some responsibility there. And the thing is, there's some people who just want to focus on a specialty, and they should.
Yeah.
Let's say they're in research and they're given a staff. Well, then, give that person a chief of staff or an assistant who can do the heavy lifting of taking care of the people, so that specialist can focus on it. And the thing is, I've known some great people, and I mean people who made huge contributions to society in their field. They wanted no part of leading people. Now, that's not to say that a person can't go from being a specialist to a leader, but the change is, and you went through it, you become more of a generalist when you become a leader, because you've got more irons in the fire. And as you probably know, John, the temptation when you've been a specialist is you want to go back to what you know. And the thing is, as a leader, you've got to be a generalist. So in fact, you've got to start learning more things, more diverse. And you may not be a specialist in all these different areas, but you've got to understand all these different activities. And so I feel very strongly it's a different mindset. You've got to be a generalist, and you have to take on all the trials and tribulations as well as the rewards of dealing with people. And the mistake that I see so many businesses make is they don't make this distinction between the specialist role and the leadership role. And particularly late in somebody's career as a specialist, they'll say, oh, now you're going to be the leader of Umpty-Ump. And I've actually seen this happen, believe it or not, at the CEO level, where you take a specialist like someone who has been general counsel, which in the exalted professions of like being a lawyer and a physician, let me tell you something, those are specialty roles. And not everyone who is very capable in those professions can become a good leader. And that's not to put them down. It's just to say that some people want to devote the time in the specialty. And I've seen people get promoted to leadership positions, and I've seen disasters occur.
Yeah. So do you think businesses should do something to where, like, because here, I get into this discussion sometimes with people where, like, the specialty, it always seems to be below the leader, on pay grade, on salary, but sometimes that specialty position is worth more financially than the leadership role that's managing that person.
Absolutely. And John, the best example of this is sports. When you look, let's take baseball. The highest paid player on the team is not the manager. In fact, I can't think of any professional team, baseball team, where the highest paid person is the manager. You've got your players out there who are making more money. And you know what? They should, because they're specialists. Now, interestingly, to take this analogy, here's a story that serves as a bit of a reinforcement and a warning. Babe Ruth was the greatest baseball player in the 20s and 30s. In many respects, he defined modern baseball because the ball was a little bit peppier suddenly in the 1920s, and Babe Ruth could hit a lot of home runs. Babe Ruth desperately wanted, at the end of his playing career, to become a manager. And guess what? No team would take him on. And the reason was because Babe Ruth misbehaved quite a bit. He was quite a character. And as one baseball executive put it, he can't control himself. How can I put him in charge of other people? And there's a case of a person who was a fabulous specialist, but he really never demonstrated that he could take on the role of the leader. And so I agree with you completely. There are people who are specialists, and they're so important. Heck yeah, they should be paid more than the person in charge. I don't see anything wrong with that at all.
Yeah, I agree 100%. But there's so many companies that have like rules that you can't manage somebody. You can't make more than the person, or somebody reporting to you can't make more than the team managing to you, and all those things.
Yeah, and I really think we've got to get rid of that thinking because, first of all, as things become more complex with digitization, AI, and everything, I think in most organizations we're going to see more specialists, and we're going to need more deep specialists. And the leadership opportunities, I think, are going to be somewhat slimmer. And I think that's where organizations need to, first of all, look for the people who are willing to take on the burden of leading, because not everybody wants to do that. And then see if those are the people who understand authority and influence and are able to practice that and are willing to become more generalist, because you have to, the higher you go in the leadership thing. But also, we need to accept that there are going to be some people whose specialty is so important, they're going to be paid more than the person above them. And like I say, I think that's common sense, actually, and I think we need to do it.
So do you have any advice for anybody that makes that shift to, like for me, it was like I had to get to the point to where I had to let go of my specialty skill, but it was hard to do. Do you have any advice of someone that's going through that maybe right now, that where they were really good at this, now they're moved into management and they have to think about a more broader picture, they have to become more of a generalist? How do they let go of that skill that they're super good at to focus more on the other things?
Well, you're right, but it's a very hard thing, as you know, and as I know, and I think a lot of people know, it's a very hard thing to give up. But we can't make our deep specialty the default when we're trying to solve problems as a leader. And I think the biggest shift you have to make is you have to say, I am now going to be more of a generalist. And I think there has to be some natural curiosity. And you have to start digging into what are the other activities now that you're supervising. And you're never going to be a specialist in each area over which you're supervising, but you've got to know something about it.
Right.
And you've got to understand where it fits in. So, and by the way, too, that's another way to use influence to get your followers on board, which is to go to one of them and say, I need to learn from you the specialty that you're in so that I can understand it. I'm never going to replace you, but I've got to understand what you're doing. And listen. And by the way, too, that's what every lieutenant in the United States Army or the Marine Corps learns pretty quickly. Let's take my case. At the age of 22, I was put in charge of 40 soldiers. By the way, about half of them who had just come back from Vietnam. So all of a sudden, here I am in charge of a platoon, which is what the unit was, and half the folks had been in combat, and only thing I'd ever been shot at was by a bunch of poachers one time that I came across in some woods. So what do? You go to people and you listen to them and you say, I need to understand what you're doing so that I can, put things at the level where I am and make the right decisions. And I think that's the other thing. Besides becoming a generalist, reach out to people so you can learn what they're doing. And then the other thing, though, is you can't be afraid as the new leader to make decisions. That's why you're there. You've got to have the courage to go ahead and make a decision. And very quickly you realize that no one, or put it another way, 100% of the people are not going to agree with your decision all the time. That ain't going to happen. And so you've got to understand that that's going to happen. And part of that, too, is you also realize that your wonderful personality isn't going to convince people that everything you're doing is great all the time. There will be tension. And you've got to learn to tolerate that and to manage through it.
Yep, absolutely. I think that's one thing people may overestimate their ability to convince someone of certain things and to manage their influence, and they have to realize that sometimes it's not going to be you're not going to make everybody happy, and you just got to do the right thing, even if it makes some people a little bit upset.
Yeah, and that's where the communication comes in. I think one of the worst things a new leader can do is to simply say something like, "Gee, I don't understand. It came down from on high, and we just have to do it." That to me is, you're not assuming the role of the leader. You're just passing something down.
Right. You're not taking the authority.
Yeah.
You're not taking the responsibility. You're not holding yourself accountable. You're not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, no, you've got to understand, as best you can, why let's say something is coming down from on high. You've got to understand what's the reasoning behind it as best you can. Sometimes it may seem utterly crazy, but in those instances, I say, in most cases, you turn to your group and you say, "Look, this is what's come down. I think we're talented enough here. We can figure this thing out. May seem a little confusing, but we've got to work it out and make it right." And you'll notice I was trying to put a positive spin on it, not like a cheerleader, but basically saying, we've got to work together and we've got to sort this thing out. And the other thing is, as a leader, you also can give good feedback back up the chain when something isn't working.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's another important thing to let your followers know. You want feedback from them, and you're going to use your position to feed the feedback further up to try to make things better as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to say thank you for your service, by the way. My dad he fought in Vietnam, so he was in the Army as well. So definitely hits home, and I appreciate all that you've done there. Do you have any last advice that you have for new leaders, especially ones switching from the specialist role, that you want to give before we end this conversation?
Sure, John. Here's the thing. It's an old joke. It's about the man who is in a big hurry, who jumps in the taxi cab in New York City. And he says to the taxi driver, "How do I get to Carnegie Hall?" And the taxi driver says, "Practice, practice, practice." And that's really my message about leadership. We read heroic stories and we see things on TV and the movies and whatever we're streaming and binge watching, especially right now. And we think, oh my gosh, this person was a natural leader and everybody agreed and all that. No, for the vast, vast majority of us, it's always going to be hard work, and it does take a lot of practice. And so I would say to somebody going into a new leadership position, pay very close attention to what you're doing and practice things. You've got to learn how to use authority, so figure out when the right time is, when the situation is right. You've got a whole host of things that you can do for influence, and practice these things and pay attention to people, see what's working, see what isn't, understand your context. But it's a marathon. Leadership is not a sprint. It's a marathon, and it's lifelong. And so I would say, take that attitude and jump in.
Yeah, I like to say it's a process, not a project. It's one of those things that you got to constantly work at. You're not going to get to a certain time where you're done. You're always going to be having to improve and work at it.
Right.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. And where can people connect with you and find more about your book and your speaking engagements and things that you're doing?
Well, thanks, John. I appreciate that. First of all, we're talking about, of course, the United States of Amazon. So certainly all the listeners, if you could, go to Amazon and you'll find my book, Leadership, Tough Love. And also, I have a new website. It's timothytlupfer.com. So that's my first name. My middle initial is T, just like Timothy, and then the last name, lupfer.com. And it shows what I'm speaking on, which is about leadership, change management, and ethics. And so please, you can go to that website as well. And my email is ttlupfer@netbox.com, so anybody can reach out to me directly as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I'll link that up in the show notes. And I got a page on the website on geekleader.com where we list books from our guests, and we'll have your book listed in there as well. So, guys, you can check that out at geekleader.com. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, John. Take care.
Hope you guys enjoyed that episode with Timothy, and if so, please head on over to Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, or wherever you share your content and share this episode. Also, the reviews and ratings have been coming in, which is great, but please remember to do that if you are an iTunes or Apple user. Go to your Apple Podcast, subscribe, and be sure to give us a 5-star rating and write a review. That'd be awesome. And if you are listening on the Overcast player, hit the little star beside the episodes. The more stars that are hit, the higher up we go in the rankings, and the more listeners listen to the show. And don't forget to thank our sponsor and head on over to geekleader.com/splashtop to get a discount for remote access solutions using the Splashtop product. I've been using them for years. Great product. Definitely check that out. geekleader.com/splashtop. Thanks so much, guys.